The Overthinking Cure, Transforming Anxiety into Action. Introduction. The quiet storm within. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the curtains, Sarah's eyes were already wide open, staring at the ceiling. She hadn't slept a wink. Again. The digital clock on her nightstand blinked 5:43 a.m., a silent witness to another night lost to the relentless whirlwind of her thoughts. In just a few hours, she would be standing in front of her colleagues, delivering a presentation that could make or break her career. But instead of feeling prepared and confident, Sarah felt like she was drowning in a sea of what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. This wasn't an isolated incident for Sarah. At 28, she was a rising star in her marketing firm, known for her creativity and attention to detail. From the outside, she appeared to have it all together: a promising career, a cozy apartment in the city, and a small but tight-knit group of friends. Yet beneath this carefully curated exterior lurked a storm that few could see or understand. Sarah was an overthinker. Overthinking. It's a word that's tossed around casually in conversation, often accompanied by a laugh or a shrug. "Oh, I'm just overthinking things again," people say, as if it's a quirky personality trait or a minor inconvenience. But for millions of people like Sarah, overthinking is far more than that. It's a quiet, insidious force that can erode confidence, hinder decision-making, and cast a shadow over even the brightest moments of life. As Sarah finally dragged herself out of bed, her mind was already racing through every possible outcome of the day ahead. What if she stumbled over her words? What if her boss hated her ideas? What if this presentation was the thing that finally exposed her as a fraud, revealing to everyone that she wasn't as competent as they thought she was? These thoughts were new. They were old friends, unwelcome visitors that had taken up permanent residence in Sarah's mind. They whispered to her as she showered, shouted at her as she picked out her outfit, and screamed at her as she sipped her morning coffee. By the time Sarah left her apartment, she felt as if she had already lived through a dozen different versions of the day, each one worse than the last. But here's the thing about overthinking: it's a master of disguise. To Sarah, these thoughts felt like preparation. If she could anticipate every possible problem, surely she could prevent them from happening, right? If she replayed every interaction, analyzed every word choice, she could optimize her performance and avoid making mistakes. This was what being responsible looked like, wasn't it? This was what it took to be successful in a competitive world. Or so she thought. What Sarah didn't realize, what many overthinkers fail to see, is that this constant mental churn comes at a steep price. It's like revving a car engine nonstop. Eventually, something's going to burn out. For Sarah, the costs were starting to add up. The sleepless nights left her exhausted and irritable. The constant self-doubt chipped away at her creativity, making it harder to come up with the innovative ideas that had once been her trademark. Worst of all, the incessant focus on what could go wrong made it almost impossible to enjoy what was going right. As Sarah walked into her office building, she passed by her colleague, Mike. "Hey, Sarah. Ready for the big presentation?" he called out cheerfully. Sarah managed a weak smile and a nod, all the while thinking, does he know something I don't? Why does he seem so casual about this? Should I be more worried? This is another hallmark of overthinking, the tendency to read into every interaction, to search for hidden meanings in the most innocuous of comments. In Sarah's mind, Mike's simple greeting became another piece of evidence in the case against her competence. But let's press pause on Sarah's story for a moment and zoom out. If you're reading this, chances are you see a bit of yourself in Sarah. Maybe you've lain awake at night, your mind spinning with worries about the future. Perhaps you've agonized over a decision, weighing every possible outcome until you're paralyzed with indecision. Or maybe you've replayed a conversation in your head, cringing at what you said and imagining all the things you should have said instead. If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. Studies suggest that overthinking affects a significant portion of the population, with some estimates suggesting that up to 73% of adults between the ages of 25 and 35 consider themselves overthinkers. It's particularly prevalent among high achievers and perfectionists, people who care deeply about their performance and the opinions of others. But here's the crucial thing to understand. Overthinking is not a character flaw. It's not a sign of weakness or incompetence. In fact, the tendency to overthink often stems from positive traits like conscientiousness, empathy, and a strong desire to do well. The problem arises when these traits are dialed up to 11, when the volume of our inner critic is turned so high that it drowns out everything else. As we follow Sarah through her day, we'll see how overthinking affects various aspects of her life. We'll witness the toll it takes on her work performance, her relationships, and her overall well-being. But more importantly, we'll join Sarah on her journey of discovery, a journey that leads her to understand the roots of her overthinking and to develop strategies for quieting the chaos in her mind. This book is not just Sarah's story, though. It's a roadmap for anyone who's ever felt trapped in the labyrinth of their own thoughts. Through Sarah's experiences, we'll explore the psychology behind overthinking, delving into the cognitive patterns and emotional triggers that fuel this mental habit. We'll look at the latest research on mindfulness, cognitive behavioral therapy, and other evidence-based approaches to managing overthinking. But this isn't just a dry recitation of facts and techniques. It's a deeply human story about the struggle to find peace in a world that often seems designed to keep us on edge. It's about learning to trust ourselves, to embrace uncertainty, and to find joy in the present moment instead of constantly worrying about the future or ruminating on the past. As we embark on this journey with Sarah, you'll discover that overcoming overthinking isn't about eliminating thoughts or achieving some state of perpetual mental calm. Instead, it's about changing our relationship with our thoughts. It's about learning to observe our mental chatter without getting caught up in it, to respond to our worries with compassion instead of criticism, and to take action even when we're not sure of the outcome. Throughout this book, you'll find practical exercises and reflection prompts that will help you apply these concepts to your own life. You'll learn techniques for interrupting the cycle of rumination, strategies for challenging your cognitive distortions, and practices for cultivating a more balanced, present-focused mindset. But perhaps most importantly, you'll find hope. Hope that it's possible to break free from the grip of overthinking. Hope that you can learn to use your analytical skills and emotional sensitivity as strengths rather than sources of stress. Hope that you can find a way to honor your conscientiousness and desire for excellence without sacrificing your peace of mind. As we return to Sarah, standing in the elevator on her way to the conference room, her heart racing and her palms sweaty, remember that this is where her journey, and yours, truly begins. It's in these moments of stress and uncertainty that we have the opportunity to choose a different path, to challenge our habitual thought patterns, and to take the first steps towards a more balanced way of thinking and living. In the chapters that follow, we'll walk alongside Sarah as she navigates the challenges of her high-pressure job, her relationships, and her own self-perception. We'll see her stumble and struggle, but we'll also see her grow and triumph. Through her story, you'll gain insights into your own patterns of overthinking and discover tools for creating a more peaceful, productive inner world. So take a deep breath and let's begin. Whether you're a chronic overthinker looking for relief, someone who occasionally gets caught in cycles of worry, or simply curious about how our minds work, there's something in these pages for you. Remember, the goal isn't to stop thinking altogether. Our ability to think deeply and care intensely are beautiful parts of what make us human. The goal is to learn how to think in a way that serves us rather than sabotages us, to find a balance between reflection and action, preparation and presence. As you read, be kind to yourself. Changing long-standing mental habits takes time and practice. There will be setbacks and challenges along the way. But with patience, persistence, and the right tools, it's possible to quiet the storm of overthinking and find clarity, confidence, and peace of mind. Are you ready to join Sarah on this journey? To explore the landscape of your own mind and discover new ways of relating to your thoughts? To learn how to use your cognitive powers as a force for growth and creativity rather than stress and self-doubt? Then turn the page. Your journey from overthinking to inner peace starts now. Chapter 1. The spiral begins. The first rays of sunlight crept through the gaps in Sarah's curtains, painting thin golden lines across her bedroom wall. Her alarm hadn't gone off yet, but it didn't matter. Sarah was already awake, her mind racing at a mile a minute. She'd been tossing and turning for hours, sleep proving to be an elusive companion once again. Today was the day of her big presentation, a project she'd been working on for weeks. It was an opportunity to showcase her ideas to the entire marketing team, including the senior executives. In theory, this should have been exciting. After all, wasn't this exactly the kind of opportunity she'd been hoping for when she joined the company 2 years ago? But for Sarah, excitement had long ago given way to anxiety. As she lay there, staring at the ceiling, her mind conjured up a myriad of worst-case scenarios. What if she fumbled her words? What if the executives hated her ideas? What if this presentation was the thing that finally exposed her as a fraud, revealing to everyone that she wasn't as competent as they thought she was? With a sigh, Sarah reached for her phone, squinting at the bright screen. 5:43 a.m. Still over an hour before she needed to get up, but she knew from experience that trying to fall back asleep was futile. Instead, she opened her email, figuring she might as well get a head start on the day. As she scrolled through her inbox, a new message from her boss caught her eye. Quick chat before the presentation, the subject line read. Sarah's heart rate immediately spiked. What could he want to talk about? Had he found a mistake in her report? Was he going to tell her the presentation was canceled? Or worse, that someone else would be giving it instead? Sarah's finger hovered over the email, her mind spinning with possibilities. She knew, rationally, that it was probably nothing serious. Her boss, Mark, was generally supportive and often liked to check in before big meetings. But in the early morning hours, with her anxiety already in high gear, rationality was in short supply. Finally, unable to bear the suspense any longer, Sarah opened the email. Just wanted to touch base before the big presentation. Nothing major, just a quick sync. Stop by my office when you get in? Mark. Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The message was benign, even friendly. And yet, she could feel her anxiety latching onto it, twisting it into something ominous. What did nothing major mean? Was that code for something? Should she be prepared for bad news? This was classic Sarah. Even the most innocent of interactions could become fodder for her overactive mind. It was as if her brain was a machine designed to find problems, to anticipate disasters, to prepare for the worst at all times. And lately, that machine had been working overtime. Unable to lie still any longer, Sarah got out of bed. She padded to the kitchen, the hardwood floor cool beneath her bare feet. As she waited for the coffee maker to work its magic, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. The face that looked back at her was tired, with dark circles under the eyes testifying to many sleepless nights. When had this become her normal? Sarah tried to remember a time when she didn't feel this constant undercurrent of anxiety, when her thoughts didn't race ahead to the worst possible outcomes. It hadn't always been this way, had it? She thought back to her college days. She'd always been conscientious, always strived to do her best. But back then, that drive had felt positive, motivating. It had pushed her to study harder, to take on challenging projects, to aim high in her career aspirations. When had that healthy ambition morphed into this constant state of worry and self-doubt? The coffee maker beeped, jolting Sarah out of her reverie. She poured herself a cup, the rich aroma momentarily grounding her in the present. But as she sipped the hot liquid, her mind was already racing ahead to the day before her. She mentally ran through her to-do list. Finalize the presentation slides. Print handouts. Double-check the meeting room reservation. Review her speaking notes one last time. Each task seemed to spawn a dozen more, until Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sheer volume of things that needed to be done. And underlying it all was a persistent whisper of doubt. Was she really ready for this presentation? Did she deserve this opportunity? What if everyone finally realized she was in over her head? Sarah shook her head, trying to dispel the negative thoughts. She knew, intellectually, that she was good at her job. She'd earned her position through hard work and talent. Her bosses and colleagues frequently praised her contributions. And yet, that nagging voice of self-doubt never seemed to quiet completely. As the sky outside began to lighten, Sarah forced herself to start getting ready for work. She showered and dressed on autopilot, her mind still churning with worries about the day ahead. As she applied her makeup, She found herself scrutinizing her reflection more closely than usual. Was that a blemish forming on her chin? Did her hair look unprofessional? She changed her blouse twice, suddenly unsure if her original choice was appropriate for such an important presentation. By the time Sarah left her apartment, she felt as if she'd already lived through a dozen different versions of the day, each one worse than the last. The morning commute, usually a time when she caught up on podcasts or planned her day, became another opportunity for her mind to spin out worst-case scenarios. As she walked into her office building, Sarah passed by her colleague, Mike. "Hey, Sarah. Ready for the big presentation?" he called out cheerfully. Sarah managed a weak smile and a nod, all the while thinking, does he know something I don't? Why does he seem so casual about this? Should I be more worried? This tendency to read into every interaction, to search for hidden meanings in the most innocuous of comments, was another hallmark of Sarah's overthinking. In her mind, Mike's simple greeting became another piece of evidence in the case against her competence. At her desk, Sarah's eyes immediately darted to the clock. 8:30 a.m. 3.5 hours until the presentation. It seemed both an eternity and no time at all. She booted up her computer, intending to give her slides one final review, but found herself instead staring at her email inbox. There, amid the usual deluge of messages, was an email from the project client. Sarah's heart rate spiked again as she clicked to open it. As she read, she felt a mix of relief and fresh anxiety wash over her. The client loved the preliminary designs her team had sent over. That was good news, right? But wait, they had a few minor suggestions. What did that mean? Were they actually unhappy with the work? Should she try to incorporate these changes into today's presentation? But what if that threw off all her carefully prepared remarks? As Sarah agonized over how to respond, she realized that an hour had passed. An hour of productive work time, lost to worry and indecision. She looked at her to-do list, which suddenly seemed even longer and more daunting than before. It was at this moment that Mark, her boss, stuck his head around the corner of her cubicle. "Hey Sarah, got a minute for that chat?" Sarah felt her stomach drop. She'd been so caught up in her spiral of worry that she'd completely forgotten about Mark's email. "Of course," she said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. She followed Mark to his office, her mind racing ahead, imagining all the possible reasons for this meeting. "So, about the presentation today," Mark began as they sat down. Sarah held her breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're feeling about it. I know it's a big opportunity, and I want to make sure you feel supported." Sarah blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the supportive tone. "Oh, I'm feeling prepared," she lied, not wanting to admit the extent of her anxiety. Mark nodded, seemingly satisfied with her response. Good. You've done great work on this project, Sarah. I have full confidence in you. Just remember to breathe and be yourself up there. You've got this." As Sarah left Mark's office a few minutes later, she felt a confusing mix of emotions. On one hand, her boss's vote of confidence should have been reassuring, but her anxious mind quickly twisted it into added pressure. What if she let Mark down? What if his faith in her was misplaced? Back at her desk, Sarah tried to refocus on her preparation, but her thoughts kept circling back to all the things that could go wrong. She rehearsed her opening lines in her head, second-guessing every word choice. She reviewed her slides for the 100th time, suddenly unsure if the data was presented clearly enough. Before she knew it, it was time for the presentation. As Sarah gathered her materials and headed to the conference room, she felt as if she was walking to her own execution. Her palms were sweaty, her heart was racing, and she could practically hear the blood rushing in her ears. Standing at the front of the room, waiting for everyone to take their seats, Sarah's mind went into overdrive. She scanned the faces of her colleagues, trying to read their expressions. Did they look skeptical? Bored? She noticed one of the executives checking his phone. Was he already disengaged before she'd even started? As Sarah began to speak, she was hyper-aware of every aspect of her performance. Was she talking too fast? Too slow? Did that joke land flat? She stumbled over a word in her third slide, and suddenly it was all she could think about. She was sure everyone had noticed, that they were all silently judging her for this small mistake. In reality, the presentation wasn't going nearly as badly as Sarah perceived. Her colleagues were engaged, nodding along with her points. The executives looked interested, jotting down notes. But Sarah couldn't see any of this. In her mind, every pause was an eternity, every slide transition a potential disaster. By the time she finished and opened the floor for questions, Sarah felt drained. She answered the questions on autopilot, all the while certain that her responses were inadequate, that she was revealing her incompetence with every word. When it was finally over, Sarah packed up her things in a daze. She barely registered the colleagues who stopped to compliment her on the presentation. All she could think about was escaping, getting back to her desk where she could dissect every moment of the last hour in excruciating detail. As Sarah sat at her desk, replaying the presentation in her mind, she felt the familiar tendrils of anxiety tightening around her chest. She had survived the presentation, but instead of feeling relieved, she found herself dreading the feedback. What if people were just being nice to her face? What if they were all talking about her mistakes behind her back right now? The rest of the day passed in a blur of worry and second-guessing. By the time Sarah left the office, she felt emotionally and physically exhausted. She had plans to meet friends for dinner, but the thought of socializing, of having to engage in conversation and present a happy facade, felt overwhelming. With a mix of guilt and relief, she sent a text canceling her plans. At home, alone with her thoughts, Sarah's mind continued its relentless analysis of the day. The presentation, the interactions with colleagues, every email she'd sent, each moment was scrutinized, each perceived flaw magnified until it overshadowed any positive aspects. As Sarah lay in bed that night, sleep once again eluding her, she couldn't help but wonder, was this what her life had become? A constant state of worry and self-doubt? An endless cycle of anticipating problems and then creating them through her very anticipation? Little did Sarah know, this night of intense overthinking would be the catalyst for change. Sometimes, we need to reach a low point before we can begin to climb back up. For Sarah, this was that point, the moment when the pain of staying the same finally outweighed the fear of change. In the chapters to come, we'll follow Sarah as she begins to recognize the toll that overthinking is taking on her life, and as she takes her first tentative steps towards breaking free from this mental prison. Her journey won't be easy or straightforward, but it will be transformative. And for those of us who see ourselves in Sarah's story, her journey offers hope. It reminds us that no matter how deeply entrenched our overthinking habits may be, change is possible. With the right tools, support, and mindset, we can learn to quiet the chaos in our minds and find a more balanced, peaceful way of engaging with the world. Chapter 2. The Ripple Effect. The morning after her presentation, Sarah woke to the harsh blare of her alarm. For a brief, blissful moment, her mind was blank. Then, like a flood, the memories of yesterday came rushing back. The presentation, the questions, the perceived missteps, it all played out in her mind like a movie she couldn't stop. She reached for her phone, a habit born of anxiety and the constant need to be connected. There were no urgent emails, no messages from her boss expressing disappointment in her performance. Yet, rather than feeling relieved, Sarah found herself scrutinizing this lack of communication. Did it mean the presentation was so unremarkable that it didn't warrant comment? Or worse, was everyone too polite to tell her how badly she'd done? As she dragged herself out of bed, Sarah felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. She tossed and turned most of the night, her mind refusing to quiet down, replaying every moment of the presentation in excruciating detail. Now, facing another day at the office, she felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. In the shower, where she usually found some measure of peace, Sarah's thoughts continued their relentless churn. She mentally rehearsed conversations she might have with colleagues, imagining their veiled criticisms and her fumbling responses. By the time she stepped out, her skin was red from the too hot water, but she hardly noticed. As she dressed, Sarah caught sight of herself in the mirror. The face that looked back at her seemed older somehow, drawn and tired. When had she last felt truly relaxed, truly present in a moment without worrying about what came next? She couldn't remember. The commute to work was a blur of nervous energy. Sarah clutched her coffee cup like a lifeline, the caffeine doing little to clear the fog of fatigue but amplifying her jitters. As she walked into the office, she felt as if every eye was on her, judging, assessing. In reality, her colleagues were absorbed in their own work, their own worries, but Sarah's overthinking mind interpreted every glance as criticism. At her desk, Sarah tried to focus on her tasks for the day, but her attention kept wandering. She found herself obsessively checking her email, hoping for some feedback on the presentation while simultaneously dreading it. When a message from her boss finally did appear in her inbox, her heart leapt into her throat. "Great job yesterday, Sarah. Let's touch base later this week to discuss next steps." It was a positive message, objectively speaking. But Sarah's anxious mind immediately began to pick it apart. What did "great job" really mean? Was it just a platitude? And next steps? Was that code for something? Maybe they were planning to reassign the project to someone else? As the morning wore on, Sarah found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on her work. Every time a colleague walked past her desk, she tensed, expecting them to stop and offer some critique of her presentation. When they didn't, she wondered if they were avoiding her, too embarrassed for her to say anything. By lunchtime, Sarah felt wrung out. The constant state of high alert was taking its toll, leaving her mentally and emotionally exhausted. As she picked at her salad, barely tasting it, she overheard two colleagues discussing plans for happy hour after work. "Hey, Sarah," one of them called over. "Want to join us for drinks later?" For a moment, Sarah was tempted. The thought of unwinding with colleagues, of possibly getting some genuine feedback on her presentation was appealing. But almost immediately, her overthinking kicked in. What if they were only inviting her out of pity? What if she went and made a fool of herself, giving them more reason to judge her? "Thanks, but I can't tonight," she heard herself saying. "Maybe next time." As her colleagues turned back to their conversation, Sarah felt a pang of regret. How many times had she turned down invitations like this? How many connections had she missed out on because of her anxiety? The afternoon dragged on, each hour feeling like an eternity. Sarah threw herself into her work, hoping to distract herself from the constant whirl of anxious thoughts. But every task, no matter how small, became an ordeal. She second-guessed every email before sending it, rewrote simple memos multiple times, and found herself paralyzed with indecision over the most minor of choices. As the workday finally came to an end, Sarah felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief to be leaving the office, away from the perceived scrutiny of her colleagues. But dread at the thought of another evening alone with her thoughts, another night of tossing and turning. On her way home, Sarah stopped at the grocery store. As she wandered the aisles, her mind drifted to the weekend ahead. Her sister had been trying to arrange a get-together, a casual dinner with a few friends. Sarah had been putting off giving a definite answer, and now she felt the familiar anxiety rising at the thought of socializing. What if she had nothing interesting to say? What if her sister's friends found her boring or awkward? What if she said something stupid and embarrassed herself? The spiral of what-ifs was so familiar now, it was almost comforting in its predictability. Back at her apartment, Sarah mechanically went through the motions of making dinner. As she ate, she scrolled through her phone, a habit she developed to avoid being alone with her thoughts. But even this mindless activity became a source of stress. Everyone on social media seemed to be living their best lives, advancing in their careers, maintaining active social lives, pursuing exciting hobbies. In comparison, Sarah felt stuck, trapped in a cycle of work and worry. After dinner, Sarah tried to distract herself with TV, but found she couldn't focus on the plot. Her mind kept drifting back to work, to the presentation, to all the things she should have said or done differently. She thought about the project she was supposed to be starting next week, and immediately felt overwhelmed by all the potential pitfalls and problems that could arise. As the evening wore on, Sarah felt the walls of her apartment closing in on her. The silence seemed to amplify her anxious thoughts, making them impossible to ignore. She thought about calling a friend, but talked herself out of it. What if they were busy? What if she was bothering them? What if they didn't really want to talk to her? Instead, she opened her laptop and began working on the new project, telling herself she was just getting a head start. In reality, it was another attempt to quiet the constant chatter in her mind, to feel productive and in control. But as the hours ticked by, Sarah found herself falling into familiar patterns of overthinking and second-guessing every decision. It was past midnight when Sarah finally closed her laptop, her eyes burning from staring at the screen for so long. As she got ready for bed, she caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. The face that looked back at her was pale and drawn, with dark circles under the eyes. She barely recognized herself. Lying in bed, Sarah found sleep elusive once again. Her mind raced from one worry to another, like a pinball bouncing between bumpers. Work concerns bled into personal anxieties, creating a tangled web of stress that seemed impossible to unravel. She thought about the presentation again, cringing at remembered moments of awkwardness. Then her mind jumped to the project she'd been working on, all the potential problems looming large in the darkness. From there, she spiraled into worries about her career in general. Was she falling behind her peers? Should she be looking for a new job? But the thought of job hunting, of interviews and uncertainty, sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. As the night wore on, Sarah's thoughts took an even darker turn. She thought about her shrinking social circle, the invitations she kept turning down, the relationships she'd let fade away. She thought about her family and the growing distance she felt from them. When was the last time she'd had a real conversation with her parents? One that went beyond surface-level pleasantries. In the early hours of the morning, exhausted but still unable to sleep, Sarah felt a deep sense of loneliness wash over her. How had she ended up here, lying awake night after night, trapped in a prison of her own making? When had her life become so small, so constrained by fear and worry? As the first light of dawn began to creep through her curtains, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't go on like this. Something had to change. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Change meant uncertainty, and uncertainty was what Sarah feared most. But at the same time, the idea of continuing on this path, of letting her life be dictated by fear and overthinking, was suddenly unbearable. With this resolution still fresh in her mind, Sarah finally drifted off into a fitful sleep. When her alarm went off a few hours later, she woke feeling groggy and disoriented. For a moment, she was tempted to call in sick, to hide away from the world for just one more day. But the memory of her middle-of-the-night epiphany pushed her to get up, to face the day. As she went through her morning routine, Sarah tried to approach things differently. When she caught herself starting to obsess over choosing the right outfit, she took a deep breath and reminded herself that no one else would scrutinize her choice as closely as she did. When she felt the familiar anxiety rising as she thought about the workday ahead, she made a conscious effort to redirect her thoughts. It wasn't easy. Years of habitual overthinking couldn't be overcome in a single morning. But for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Arriving at the office, Sarah was surprised to find her boss, Mark, already there. He called her into his office, and for a moment, the old familiar anxiety threatened to overwhelm her. But she took a deep breath, reminding herself of her resolution to change. "Sarah," Mark began, "I wanted to talk to you about the presentation the other day." Sarah braced herself, but forced herself to remain calm and listen. "You did a great job," Mark continued, "but I couldn't help noticing that you seemed tense. Is everything okay?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She had been so focused on her perceived failures, so caught up in her own anxious thoughts, that she hadn't considered how her stress might be apparent to others. For a moment, she was tempted to brush off Mark's concern with a casual "I'm fine," but something stopped her. Maybe it was the sleepless night, or the resolution she'd made in the early hours of the morning. Maybe it was just the accumulated weight of months of anxiety and stress. Whatever the reason, Sarah found herself opening up to Mark in a way she never had before. She told him about the constant worry, the sleepless nights, the way every task and interaction became a source of stress. She spoke about her fear of making mistakes, of letting people down, of not being good enough. As she talked, it was as if a dam had broken, releasing months, perhaps years, of pent-up anxiety and self-doubt. When she finally fell silent, Sarah felt drained but somehow lighter. She looked up at Mark, half expecting to see disappointment or judgment in his eyes. Instead, she saw understanding and compassion. "Sarah," he said gently, "what you're describing sounds a lot like anxiety. I'm not a doctor, but I've seen similar things in other high-performing employees. Have you considered talking to someone about this? A professional, I mean." Sarah shook her head. The thought had crossed her mind, but she had always pushed it away. Seeking help felt like admitting defeat, like confirming that she couldn't handle her own life. "I know it can seem daunting," Mark continued, "but there's no shame in getting help. In fact, it's one of the bravest things you can do. Our company has an employee assistance program that offers confidential counseling. I really think it could help you." As Mark spoke, Sarah felt the mix of emotions washing over her. There was relief at having finally voiced her struggles, fear at the prospect of confronting her issues head-on, and a tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. I'll think about it," she said finally. Mark nodded. "That's all I ask. And Sarah? Take the rest of the day off. Get some rest. We'll manage without you for one day." As Sarah left Mark's office, she felt as if she was in a daze. The conversation had been so far from what she had expected that she was having trouble processing it. She gathered her things and left the office, her colleagues' curious glances barely registering. Outside, the busy streets of the city seemed oddly muted. Sarah found herself wandering, no particular destination in mind. Her feet carried her to a small park near her office, a place she often passed but rarely entered. Today, she felt drawn to its quiet paths and shaded benches. Sitting down on a bench, Sarah took a deep breath. For the first time in what felt like ages, she allowed herself to be still. No frantic planning for the next task, no obsessive rehashing of past events. Just the present moment, the warmth of the sun on her face, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant sounds of the city. As she sat there, Sarah's conversation with Mark replayed in her mind. She thought about how long she had been struggling, how exhausted she felt all the time. She thought about the friendships she had neglected, the opportunities she had missed out on because of her constant anxiety. And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine what life might be like without the constant weight of overthinking pressing down on her. It was a bittersweet moment of clarity. On one hand, recognizing the extent of her problem was painful. It forced her to confront the fact that she had been living a half-life, held back by her own thoughts. On the other hand, this recognition brought with it a glimmer of hope. If she could see the problem, maybe she could also find a solution. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. She people-watched. She observed couples strolling hand in hand, children playing on the grass, elderly folks feeding the pigeons. She saw people laughing, arguing, daydreaming. And as she watched, she realized how much of life she had been missing while trapped in her own head. A young woman caught her attention. She was sitting on the grass, completely engrossed in a book. What struck Sarah was the woman's expression, one of total absorption and contentment. "When was the last time I felt like that?" Sarah wondered. "When was the last time I was so present in a moment that I forgot to worry?" As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Sarah knew it was time to head home. But something had shifted inside her. The constant buzz of anxious thoughts that had been her constant companion for so long had quieted, if only temporarily. In its place was a new feeling, a mix of exhaustion, sadness, and a tiny but persistent glimmer of hope. Sarah didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if she would have the courage to seek help, or if she could really change the patterns of thinking that had defined her life for so long. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to try. And that, she realized, was a start. Chapter 3. The Wake-Up Call. The morning after her conversation with Mark and her afternoon of introspection in the park, Sarah woke up feeling different. It wasn't a dramatic change. The weight of her habitual anxiety still pressed on her, but there was a subtle shift, a tiny crack in the fortress of overthinking she had built around herself. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Sarah replayed the events of the previous day. The conversation with Mark, his gentle suggestion that she might need help, the unexpected afternoon off that had led her to the park. It all felt slightly surreal, as if it had happened to someone else. For a moment, Sarah felt the familiar tendrils of anxiety creeping in. What if Mark thought less of her now that he knew about her struggles? What if her colleagues had noticed her absence and were gossiping about her? What if? Sarah took a deep breath, consciously interrupting the spiral of what-ifs before it could gain momentum. This was new for her, this awareness of her thought patterns. It felt strange, almost uncomfortable, like exercising a muscle she'd never used before. As she went through her morning routine, Sarah found herself noticing things she usually overlooked in her rush to get to work and start worrying about the day ahead. The warmth of the shower on her skin, the aroma of her coffee, the way the morning light filtered through her kitchen window, small details that she had been too preoccupied to appreciate for far too long. On her commute to work, Sarah made a conscious effort to stay present. Instead of immediately pulling out her phone to check emails or scroll through social media, activities that often fueled her anxiety, she looked out the window, observing the city waking up around her. It wasn't easy. Her mind kept trying to wander to work concerns, to replay conversations, to worry about future tasks. But each time it did, Sarah gently brought her attention back to the present moment. Arriving at the office, Sarah felt a mix of emotions. There was the usual undercurrent of anxiety, but also a strange sense of anticipation. After yesterday's conversation with Mark, she felt as if she was seeing her workplace through new eyes. As she settled at her desk, Sarah noticed an email from the company's Human Resources Department. The subject line read, Employee Assistance Program, Confidential Resources. Her heart rate quickened as she opened it. The email was a general announcement sent to all employees, detailing the company's mental health resources. It wasn't a personal message to Sarah, but the timing felt significant. Was this a coincidence, or had Mark asked HR to send out this reminder? Sarah's first instinct was to close the email immediately. The thought of seeking help, of admitting to someone else the extent of her struggles, was terrifying. But she forced herself to read through the information, noting the phone number for the confidential counseling service. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself alternating between moments of clarity and determination and periods of intense doubt and anxiety. One moment, she would feel ready to make the call, to take the first step towards change. The next, she would be overwhelmed by fear and uncertainty. What if the counselor thought her problems were trivial? What if talking about her issues only made them worse? What if she couldn't be helped? By lunchtime, Sarah felt mentally exhausted from the internal tug-of-war. As she picked at her salad, barely tasting it, she overheard two colleagues discussing their weekend plans. The conversation drifted to a local art exhibition that was opening on Saturday. Hey Sarah, one of them said, turning to her. You're into art, right? Want to join us on Saturday? Sarah felt a familiar pang of anxiety at the invitation. Her usual response would have been to make up an excuse, to retreat into the safety of solitude. But something made her hesitate. She thought about the woman she had seen in the park yesterday, so absorbed in her book. She thought about all the invitations she had turned down over the past months, the connections she had let slip away. And in that moment, Sarah made a decision. You know what? That sounds great, she heard herself saying. Count me in. The words were out of her mouth before she could overthink them, and the smile on her colleague's face was immediate and genuine. Awesome. We'll sort out the details later. As her colleagues returned to their conversation, Sarah felt a strange mix of anxiety and excitement. The prospect of a social outing was daunting, but there was also a tiny thrill at the thought of breaking out of her self-imposed isolation. The afternoon brought a team meeting, something that would usually have sent Sarah into a spiral of anxiety. As she sat around the conference table with her colleagues, she made a conscious effort to stay present, to listen actively instead of getting lost in her own worried thoughts. When it came time for her to speak, Sarah felt the familiar flutter of nerves in her stomach. But she took a deep breath, reminding herself that she knew her subject matter, that her contributions were valuable. To her surprise, she found herself speaking more confidently than she had in months. After the meeting, as everyone was filing out of the room, Mark caught her eye and gave her a subtle nod of approval. The simple gesture sent a wave of relief through Sarah. Maybe she could do this. Maybe change was possible. As the workday drew to a close, Sarah found herself facing a familiar dilemma. Should she stay late, trying to get ahead on tomorrow's tasks? It was what she usually did, driven by the fear of falling behind, of not being good enough. But today, Sarah made a different choice. She packed up her things at 5:30, alongside most of her colleagues. As she walked out of the office, she felt a strange sense of liberation. The world hadn't ended because she left work on time. The sky hadn't fallen. On her way home, Sarah stopped at a bookstore, drawn by an impulse she didn't quite understand. As she browsed the shelves, a title caught her eye, The Overthinking Cure, Reclaim Your Time, Energy, and Peace of Mind. Without allowing herself to second-guess the decision, she bought it. At home, Sarah settled on her couch with a cup of tea and opened the book. As she began to read, she felt a growing sense of recognition. The author described thought patterns and behaviors that Sarah had always believed were unique to her. There was a strange comfort in realizing that not only was she not alone in her struggles, but that there was a name for what she was experiencing. As she read further, Sarah came across a passage that stopped her in her tracks. Overthinking is not a character flaw or a sign of weakness. It's a habit, often born out of a desire to do well and avoid mistakes. But like any habit, it can be changed. The first step is becoming aware of your thought patterns. The second is learning to challenge those thoughts. And the third is practicing new ways of thinking and being. Sarah read and reread these words, letting them sink in. For so long, she had seen her tendency to overthink as an integral part of who she was. The idea that it was a habit, something that could be changed, was both terrifying and exhilarating. As she continued reading, Sarah found herself nodding along, highlighting passages, and even laughing out loud at some of the examples that hit close to home. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of hope. Maybe she wasn't broken. Maybe she didn't have to live like this forever. It was late when Sarah finally put the book down. Her mind was buzzing, not with anxious thoughts for once, but with new ideas and possibilities. She knew that reading one book wasn't going to magically cure her overthinking, but it felt like a start. A step in the right direction. As she got ready for bed, Sarah caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face that looked back at her was tired, with dark circles under the eyes testifying to many sleepless nights. But there was something else there too, a spark in her eyes that had been missing for a long time. Lying in bed, Sarah made a decision. Tomorrow, she would call the Employee Assistance Program and schedule an appointment with a counselor. The thought made her nervous. What would she say? What if the counselor thought she was weak or silly for struggling with something that other people seemed to handle effortlessly? But underneath the nervousness was a sense of determination. She couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. For the first time in months, Sarah fell asleep quickly, her mind quieter than it had been in a long time. The next morning, Sarah woke up feeling different. The constant background noise of worried thoughts was still there, but it seemed somewhat muted. As if her decision to seek help had turned down the volume just a little bit. She went through her morning routine, noticing how often her mind tried to drag her into worry about the day ahead. But today, instead of getting caught up in these thoughts, she tried to simply observe them. "I'm having the thought that I'll mess up at work today," she told herself, remembering a technique from the book. But that's just a thought, not a fact. At work, Sarah kept her head down, focusing on her tasks one at a time. When she caught herself starting to spiral into overthinking, she took a deep breath and gently brought her attention back to the present moment. It wasn't easy, and she didn't always succeed, but it felt like a small victory each time she managed to interrupt the cycle. During her lunch break, Sarah found a quiet corner and pulled out her phone. Her hand shook slightly as she dialed the number for the Employee Assistance Program. As the phone rang, she felt a strong urge to hang up, to retreat back into the familiar discomfort of her anxiety. But she held on, and when a kind voice answered on the other end, Sarah found herself speaking before she could change her mind. "Hi, I'd like to schedule an appointment with a counselor." The process was simpler than she had feared. Within a few minutes, Sarah had an appointment scheduled for the following week. As she ended the call, she felt a mix of relief and apprehension. This was really happening. She was taking a step towards change. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Sarah found herself alternating between moments of hope and optimism, and periods of doubt and fear. What if therapy didn't help? What if she was beyond help? What if? She caught herself, recognizing the familiar pattern of what if thinking. Gently, she redirected her thoughts, focusing on the tasks at hand rather than an imagined future. As she was packing up to leave work, Sarah remembered the art exhibition she had agreed to attend on Saturday. For a moment, she was tempted to back out, to send a message with some excuse about why she couldn't make it. It would be easier, safer, to stay home. But Sarah resisted the urge. Instead, she sent a message to her colleague, confirming the time and place they would meet. As she hit send, she felt a small thrill of excitement, mixed with her anxiety. This was part of changing too, not just working on her thoughts, but changing her behaviors as well. That evening, as Sarah sat on her couch with her newly purchased book, she reflected on the past couple of days. So much had happened. So much had changed. And yet, on the surface, her life looked much the same. The change was internal, a shift in perspective that was subtle but profound. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Years of habitual overthinking couldn't be undone overnight. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, times when she would be tempted to retreat back into her old patterns. But for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt hope. She had taken the first steps towards change, recognizing her problem, seeking help, starting to challenge her thought patterns. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As she closed her book and got ready for bed, Sarah felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth. But for now, in this moment, she was okay. And that, she realized, was enough. Chapter 4. The First Steps. The week leading up to Sarah's first therapy appointment seemed to pass in a blur. Each day brought a mix of anticipation and anxiety, hope and fear. Sarah found herself oscillating between moments of determination and periods of doubt. Was she really ready for this? Could talking to a stranger really help her overcome years of ingrained thought patterns? On the morning of her appointment, Sarah woke up earlier than usual, her stomach churning with nervous energy. She went through her morning routine mechanically, her mind preoccupied with what lay ahead. As she stood in front of her closet, she found herself agonizing over what to wear. Should she dress up to make a good impression? Or would that seem like she was trying too hard? Would casual clothes make her look like she wasn't taking this seriously? She caught herself mid-spiral and took a deep breath. This is just overthinking, she reminded herself. It doesn't matter what I wear. What matters is that I'm going. Eventually, she settled on an outfit that felt comfortable yet put together. As she left her apartment, she felt a strange mix of emotions, as if she was embarking on a journey to an unknown destination. The therapy office was located in a nondescript building downtown. As Sarah sat in the waiting room, she found herself studying the other people there. A middle-aged man leafing through a magazine. A young woman typing furiously on her phone. An elderly couple sitting close together, holding hands. Sarah wondered about their stories, what had brought them here. It was oddly comforting to realize that she wasn't alone in seeking help. When her name was called, Sarah's heart rate spiked. This is it, she thought. No turning back now. The therapist, Dr. Emily Chin, was a woman in her 40s with a kind face and a calm demeanor. As Sarah settled into a comfortable armchair across from her, she felt some of her nervousness begin to dissipate. So, Sarah, Dr. Chin began, her voice warm and reassuring. What brings you here today? For a moment, Sarah felt overwhelmed. Where should she start? How could she possibly explain the tangled web of thoughts and fears that had led her to this point? But as she began to speak, hesitantly at first, then with increasing urgency, she found the words coming more easily than she had expected. She told Dr. Chan about the constant worry, the sleepless nights, the way every task and interaction had become a source of stress. She spoke about her fear of making mistakes, of letting people down, of not being good enough. As she talked, it was as if a dam had broken, releasing months, perhaps years, of pent-up anxiety and self-doubt. Dr. Chen listened attentively, occasionally asking questions or offering gentle prompts. When Sarah finally fell silent, feeling drained but somehow lighter, Dr. Chen smiled warmly. "Thank you for sharing that with me, Sarah," she said. "It takes a lot of courage to open up like that, especially on a first session. What you're describing sounds like a classic case of overthinking and anxiety. The good news is, these are issues that we can work on together." Sarah felt a surge of relief at these words. There was a name for what she was experiencing. It wasn't just her being weak or incompetent. It was a recognized issue, something that could be addressed. Dr. Chen went on to explain some of the basics of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, the approach she used in her practice. CBT is based on the idea that our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all interconnected, she explained. By learning to identify and challenge negative thought patterns, we can change how we feel and behave. As Dr. Chen spoke, Sarah found herself nodding along. It made sense. She could see how her anxious thoughts led to anxious feelings, which in turn led to avoidant behaviors, which then reinforced her anxious thoughts. It was a cycle she had been trapped in for so long without even realizing it. For this week, Dr. Chen said as their session was drawing to a close, "I'd like you to start keeping a thought journal. Whenever you notice yourself overthinking or feeling anxious, jot down what triggered it, what thoughts you're having, and how those thoughts make you feel. Don't try to change anything yet, just observe and record. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded, feeling a mix of apprehension and determination. It seemed simple enough, but she knew from experience how challenging it could be to confront her own thoughts head-on. As she left the therapist's office, Sarah felt drained but also strangely energized. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was taking concrete steps towards change. Over the next few days, Sarah diligently kept her thought journal as Dr. Chen had suggested. At first, it was overwhelming to see just how often she fell into patterns of overthinking. She found herself recording multiple entries each day, from minor worries about whether she had locked her apartment door to major anxieties about her performance at work. But as the week progressed, Sarah began to notice something interesting. The very act of writing down her thoughts seemed to create a bit of distance from them. Instead of getting completely caught up in a spiral of worry, she could step back and observe, "Oh, I'm having that thought again." On Saturday, the day of the art exhibition she had agreed to attend with her colleagues, Sarah woke up feeling a familiar sense of dread. Her first instinct was to cancel, to retreat into the safety of solitude. But as she reached for her phone to send a message, she hesitated. Instead, she picked up her thought journal and began to write. Trigger: upcoming social event. Thoughts: I'll have nothing interesting to say. They'll think I'm boring. I'll make a fool of myself. Feelings: anxiety, fear, self-doubt. Looking at her thoughts written down on paper, Sarah felt a moment of clarity. These were just thoughts, not facts. They weren't predictions of the future, just habitual patterns of thinking she had fallen into. Taking a deep breath, Sarah made a decision. She would go to the exhibition. She would challenge these thoughts. And whatever happened, she would use it as an opportunity to learn and grow. The exhibition turned out to be far less stressful than Sarah had anticipated. Her colleagues were friendly and inclusive, and Sarah found herself genuinely enjoying the art. There were moments of anxiety, times when she felt self-conscious or worried about what to say. But each time, she reminded herself, these are just thoughts. They don't define me. By the time she returned home that evening, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment. She had faced her fears and survived. More than that, she had actually enjoyed herself at times. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it felt like progress. The following week brought new challenges and opportunities for growth. At work, Sarah found herself becoming more aware of how often she second-guessed herself, how much time and energy she spent worrying about potential problems that rarely materialized. During a team meeting, when her boss asked for volunteers to lead a new project, Sarah felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in her stomach. Her habitual response would have been to stay quiet, to avoid the potential for failure or criticism. But this time, she took a deep breath and raised her hand. "I'd like to take that on," she heard herself saying, her voice steadier than she felt. The look of approval on her boss's face sent a wave of relief through Sarah. She had done it. She had pushed past her fear and taken a step forward. As the days passed, Sarah continued to work on the techniques Dr. Chen had taught her. She practiced mindfulness, learning to stay present in the moment instead of getting lost in worries about the future or regrets about the past. She worked on challenging her negative thoughts, asking herself questions like, "Is this really true?" or "What evidence do I have for and against this thought?" It wasn't easy. There were days when Sarah felt overwhelmed, when the old patterns of overthinking seemed impossible to break. There were nights when she lay awake, her mind racing with worries and what-ifs. But even on those difficult days, she could see progress. The mere fact that she was aware of her thought patterns, that she was actively working to change them, felt like a significant step forward. In her therapy sessions, Sarah and Dr. Chin delved deeper into the roots of her overthinking. They explored Sarah's childhood experiences, her relationship with her parents, the early experiences that had shaped her beliefs about herself and the world. Often, Dr. Chin explained, overthinking is a coping mechanism we develop in response to uncertainty or a lack of control in our environment. By trying to anticipate every possible outcome, we believe we can protect ourselves from harm or disappointment. This resonated deeply with Sarah. She thought back to her childhood, to the high expectations her parents had placed on her, to the praise she had received for being such a careful, thoughtful child. She began to see how her tendency to overthink had been reinforced over the years, how it had become her default mode of operating in the world. As she gained these insights, Sarah found herself becoming more compassionate towards herself. Instead of berating herself for her anxiety or her struggles, she began to recognize them as understandable responses to her experiences. This self-compassion, Dr. Chin assured her, was a crucial part of the healing process. One evening, about a month into her therapy journey, Sarah found herself facing an unexpected challenge. Her sister called, inviting her to a family dinner the following weekend. In the past, such invitations had been a source of stress for Sarah. She would agonize over what to wear, what to say, how to present herself in the best possible light. Often, she would end up making an excuse not to go. This time, Sarah felt the familiar anxiety rising. But something was different. Instead of immediately spiraling into overthinking, she paused. She took a deep breath and reached for her thought journal. Trigger. Family dinner invitation. Thoughts. It will be awkward. They'll ask about my job, and I won't know what to say. They'll think I'm a failure. Feelings. Anxiety, fear, shame. As she looked at her thoughts written down, Sarah felt a moment of clarity. These were old, familiar patterns. They weren't necessarily true. And even if the dinner did turn out to be awkward or uncomfortable, would that really be the end of the world? Sarah thought about the progress she had made over the past month. She thought about the tools she had learned, the insights she had gained. And she made a decision. That sounds great, she told her sister. I'd love to come. As she hung up the phone, Sarah felt a mix of anxiety and excitement. She knew the dinner wouldn't be easy. There would likely be moments of discomfort, times when her overthinking tried to take over. But she also knew she had the tools to handle it. And more importantly, she had the courage to try. This, Sarah realized, was what taking the first steps towards change really looked like. It wasn't about eliminating anxiety or becoming a completely different person overnight. It was about facing her fears, challenging her thoughts, and slowly but surely building a new relationship with herself and the world around her. As she got ready for bed that night, Sarah caught sight of herself in the mirror. The face that looked back at her was familiar, but somehow different. There was a steadiness in her gaze, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. She was still Sarah, still the thoughtful, conscientious person she had always been. But she was also becoming someone new, Someone who could recognize her own strength, who could face her fears, who could embrace uncertainty as a natural part of life. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks and challenges, moments of doubt and fear. But as Sarah climbed into bed, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. She was on the right path. She was taking the first steps towards a new way of living, thinking, and being. And for now, in this moment, that was enough. Chapter 5. Confronting the Root. As Sarah continued her therapy sessions with Dr. Chun, she found herself delving deeper into the origins of her overthinking patterns. Each session felt like peeling back another layer of an onion, revealing more about herself and her thought processes. One particularly memorable session began with Dr. Chun asking, "Sarah, have you ever wondered why you feel the need to overthink everything?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She had always assumed that overthinking was just part of who she was, like having brown hair or being right-handed. The idea that there might be a specific reason behind it was both intriguing and slightly unsettling. I'm not sure," Sarah replied hesitantly. "I guess I've always been this way." Dr. Chun nodded encouragingly. "It's common to feel that way. But often, our thought patterns and behaviors have roots in our past experiences, particularly from childhood. Let's explore that a bit, shall we?" Over the next hour, Dr. Chun guided Sarah through a series of questions about her childhood. As Sarah spoke, memories she hadn't thought about in years began to surface. She remembered being a quiet, studious child, always eager to please her parents and teachers. "I was the good kid," Sarah explained. "The one who always did her homework, never got in trouble." "And how did the adults in your life respond to that behavior?" Dr. Chun prompted. Sarah thought for a moment. "They praised me a lot," she said. "My parents were always telling me how proud they were of my grades, how responsible I was." As she spoke, Sarah began to see a pattern emerging. The more she excelled, the more praise she received. The more responsible and careful she was, the more the adults in her life approved. "It sounds like you learned early on that being careful and thorough was a way to gain approval," Dr. Chun observed. Sarah nodded slowly, a realization dawning. "I guess I did," she said. "And the flip side was that making mistakes or being careless was, well, it wasn't encouraged." Dr. Chun leaned forward slightly. "Can you think of a specific instance when making a mistake led to a negative outcome?" Sarah's mind immediately went to a memory she hadn't thought about in years. She was 9 years old, working on a school project. In her eagerness to finish, she had rushed through it, making careless errors. When she proudly showed it to her father, instead of the praise she expected, she received criticism. "He didn't yell or anything," Sarah explained, her voice quiet. "But he was clearly disappointed. He said, 'Sarah, this isn't like you. I know you can do better than this. Why don't you take more time and do it right?'" As she recounted the memory, Sarah felt a tightness in her chest. She could still vividly recall the shame and disappointment she had felt in that moment. "That must have been difficult for you," Dr. Chun said gently. "How do you think that experience affected you?" Sarah thought for a moment. "I guess I learned that rushing and making mistakes led to disappointment. That to be good, I had to be careful, to double and triple check everything." Dr. Chun nodded. "And how do you see that playing out in your adult life?" The connection suddenly became clear to Sarah. Her constant need to review her work, to anticipate every possible outcome, to agonize over every decision. It all stemmed from that early lesson that mistakes were unacceptable, that she had to be perfect to be worthy of approval. "It's like I'm still that 9-year-old girl," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Still trying to prove that I'm good enough, still terrified of disappointing anyone." Dr. Chen's voice was kind as she replied, "That's a very common experience, Sarah. Many of us carry these childhood lessons into adulthood, often without realizing it. The good news is, now that you're aware of it, you can start to challenge and change these patterns." For the remainder of the session, Dr. Chun helped Sarah explore how this childhood experience had shaped her beliefs about herself and the world. They discussed how Sarah's fear of making mistakes had evolved into a pattern of overthinking and anxiety, a constant attempt to control every aspect of her life to avoid disappointment or criticism. As Sarah left the therapist's office that day, she felt both drained and oddly liberated. Understanding the root of her overthinking didn't immediately solve the problem, but it did give her a new perspective. She wasn't inherently flawed or broken. She had simply developed a coping mechanism that no longer served her. Over the next few weeks, Sarah found herself paying more attention to the thoughts and behaviors that stemmed from this core belief. She noticed how often she hesitated to make decisions, paralyzed by the fear of making the wrong choice. She became aware of the constant internal monologue of self-criticism, always pushing her to do more, be better, work harder. During a team meeting at work, Sarah caught herself falling into familiar patterns. As her colleagues discussed a new project, she found herself mentally cataloging all the potential problems, all the ways things could go wrong. Her instinct was to speak up, to point out every possible pitfall. But this time, armed with her new understanding, Sarah paused. She took a deep breath and asked herself, is this really about the project, or is this my old fear of making mistakes? With this awareness, Sarah made a conscious choice to participate in the discussion differently. Instead of focusing solely on potential problems, she allowed herself to get excited about the project's possibilities. When she did point out a potential issue, she framed it constructively as a challenge to be solved rather than a reason not to proceed. After the meeting, Sarah's boss pulled her aside. "Great input today, Sarah," he said. "I really appreciated your balanced perspective. It's clear you've given this a lot of thought." The praise sent a warm glow through Sarah. She realized that by loosening her grip on perfectionism, by allowing herself to be more open and flexible, she had actually performed better. This experience at work was just one of many small victories Sarah experienced as she continued to confront the root of her overthinking. Each time she caught herself falling into old patterns, she would pause and remind herself of where these thoughts came from. Sometimes she was able to challenge and change the thoughts. Other times, the best she could do was acknowledge them and try not to get caught up in them. In her personal life, Sarah found herself taking small risks she would have avoided in the past. She signed up for a pottery class, something she had always wanted to try, but had put off, fearing she wouldn't be good at it. On her first day, as she sat at the potter's wheel, her hands covered in clay, she felt a mixture of anxiety and exhilaration. Her first attempts were, predictably, far from perfect. In the past, this would have sent Sarah into a spiral of self-criticism and doubt. But now, she was able to laugh at her lopsided creations, to enjoy the process of learning and improving. By the end of the class, she had produced a small, wobbly bowl that she proudly displayed on her coffee table, a tangible reminder that imperfection could be beautiful too. As Sarah continued to work with Dr. Chen, they delved deeper into her childhood experiences and the beliefs she had formed about herself and the world. They explored her relationship with her parents, her experiences at school, and the ways in which her early environment had shaped her tendency to overthink. One session focused on Sarah's relationship with her mother. As they talked, Sarah began to see how her mother's own anxieties and perfectionist tendencies had influenced her. "My mom always meant well," Sarah explained. "But she was always worrying, always trying to anticipate and prevent any possible problem." Dr. Chen nodded. "It's very common for children to pick up on and internalize their parents' anxieties. How do you think your mother's behavior affected you?" Sarah thought for a moment. "I guess I learned that the world was a dangerous place, that I always needed to be on guard, and that if I just thought about things enough, planned carefully enough, I could prevent bad things from happening." This realization was both painful and liberating for Sarah. On one hand, it was difficult to confront the ways in which her upbringing had contributed to her current struggles. On the other hand, understanding the origins of her overthinking helped her to have more compassion for herself. As she continued to explore these childhood roots, Sarah also began to see how her overthinking had served a purpose. It had been a way to feel safe in an uncertain world, a method of trying to control the uncontrollable. Recognizing this allowed Sarah to approach her overthinking with more understanding and less judgment. One evening, as Sarah was journaling about her progress, she had a profound realization. She wrote, "My overthinking isn't the enemy. It's a part of me that was trying to keep me safe. It's like an overprotective friend who means well but goes too far. I don't need to fight against it or try to eliminate it completely. I just need to thank it for its concern and then gently let it know that I can handle things now. This shift in perspective marked a turning point in Sarah's journey. Instead of seeing her overthinking as a flaw to be eradicated, she began to approach it with curiosity and compassion. When she caught herself spiraling into anxious thoughts, she would pause and say to herself, "I see you're trying to protect me. Thank you, but I've got this." As Sarah continued to confront the root of her overthinking, she found that her relationships began to change as well. She became more open with her friends and family about her struggles, sharing what she was learning in therapy. To her surprise, many of them opened up in return, sharing their own experiences with anxiety and self-doubt. These conversations helped Sarah realize that she wasn't alone in her struggles. Everyone, it seemed, had their own battles with self-doubt and fear. This understanding helped her feel more connected to others and less isolated in her experiences. One particularly meaningful conversation happened with her sister, Emily. Over coffee one Saturday morning, Sarah found herself sharing some of what she had been learning in therapy. To her surprise, Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I had no idea you were going through all this," Emily said. "I always thought you had everything together. You seemed so confident and successful." Sarah was stunned. "Really? I always thought you had it all figured out. You always seem so sure of yourself." The sisters looked at each other and burst out laughing. It was a moment of genuine connection, of seeing past the facades they had both maintained for so long. As they continued to talk, Sarah realized how much her overthinking had affected her relationships. She had often held back, afraid of saying the wrong thing or making a mistake. She had canceled plans when her anxiety got too overwhelming, slowly distancing herself from the people she cared about. "I want to be more present," Sarah told her sister. "More real. I'm tired of letting my fears hold me back from connecting with people." Emily reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. "I'm here for you," she said simply. "Whatever you need." This conversation and others like it helped Sarah see that confronting the root of her overthinking wasn't just about changing her thought patterns. It was about changing how she engaged with the world, how she allowed herself to be seen and known by others. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah continued to make progress. There were still difficult days, times when her old thought patterns threatened to overwhelm her. But increasingly, she found herself able to recognize these patterns for what they were: old habits, not absolute truths. In her therapy sessions, Dr. Chin introduced new techniques to help Sarah manage her overthinking. They practiced mindfulness exercises, helping Sarah learn to stay present in the moment instead of getting lost in worries about the future. They worked on cognitive restructuring, teaching Sarah how to challenge and reframe her negative thoughts. One particularly powerful technique was visualization. Dr. Chin guided Sarah through exercises where she imagined herself as a child, facing the situations that had contributed to her overthinking tendencies. In these visualizations, Sarah would comfort and reassure her younger self, providing the understanding and acceptance she had needed back then. These exercises were often emotional for Sarah, bringing up feelings of sadness and compassion for her younger self. But they also helped her develop a kinder, more nurturing inner voice to counter the critical one she had lived with for so long. As Sarah continued to confront the root of her overthinking, she found that her whole outlook on life began to shift. She started to see challenges as opportunities for growth rather than potential disasters. She began to trust herself more, to believe in her ability to handle whatever life threw her way. One day, as Sarah was leaving her therapy session, Dr. Chin said something that stuck with her. "Remember, Sarah, the goal isn't to never have anxious thoughts. It's to change your relationship with those thoughts, to see them for what they are, and to not let them control your life." Sarah nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. She knew she still had work to do, that confronting the root of her overthinking was an ongoing process. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful about the future. She was no longer at the mercy of her anxious thoughts. She was learning to observe them, understand them, and gently guide herself towards a more balanced way of thinking and living. As she stepped out into the sunlight, Sarah took a deep breath. The world seemed a little brighter, a little less threatening. She was ready to face whatever came next, not with fear and overthinking, but with courage, self-compassion, and a newfound trust in herself. Chapter 6. The Turning Point. As Sarah continued her journey of self-discovery and healing, she found herself approaching a critical juncture. The insights she had gained about the roots of her overthinking had been invaluable, but she knew that understanding alone wasn't enough. It was time to put her new knowledge into practice, to truly challenge the patterns that had held her back for so long. It was a crisp autumn morning when Sarah woke up to an email that would set the stage for her turning point. Her boss, Mark, had sent out a company-wide message announcing an upcoming team-building retreat. The email outlined a weekend of activities designed to foster creativity, collaboration, and stepping out of comfort zones. In the past, such an announcement would have sent Sarah into a spiral of anxiety. She would have obsessed over every detail, imagining all the ways she could embarrass herself or let her team down. But as she read the email now, she felt a different emotion stirring within her, a mix of apprehension and excitement. Sarah took a deep breath and reached for her journal, a habit she had developed during her therapy sessions. She wrote, "Feeling nervous about the retreat, but also curious? This could be a chance to practice everything I've been learning, to show myself that I can handle uncertainty without overthinking every detail." As the retreat drew nearer, Sarah found herself oscillating between determination and doubt. There were moments when she felt ready to embrace the challenge, to push herself beyond her usual boundaries. But there were also times when her old thought patterns threatened to take over, when the urge to overthink and overprepare felt almost overwhelming. The night before the retreat, as Sarah was packing her bag, she felt a familiar tightness in her chest. What if she forgot something important? What if she couldn't keep up with the activities? What if? She caught herself mid-spiral and paused. Closing her eyes, she took a few deep breaths, using the mindfulness techniques Dr. Chun had taught her. When she opened her eyes, she saw her reflection in the mirror. The face looking back at her was familiar, but there was a new determination in her eyes. "You've got this," she said out loud to her reflection. "Whatever happens, you can handle it." The next morning, as Sarah boarded the bus with her colleagues, she felt a flutter of nerves in her stomach. But alongside the anxiety was a spark of excitement. This was a real-world test of everything she had been working on. The retreat center was nestled in a beautiful wooded area, the trees ablaze with autumn colors. As the team gathered for their first activity, Sarah found herself hanging back slightly, observing. Their facilitator, an energetic woman named Jamie, explained that they would be starting with an improv exercise. "The key to improv," Jamie said with a grin, "is to say yes and no matter what your partner throws at you, you accept it and build on it. It's all about embracing the unexpected." Sarah felt her heart rate quicken. Improv had always been her worst nightmare. No script, no time to prepare, just spontaneous interaction. Everything her overthinking mind rebelled against. As her colleagues paired up, Sarah found herself partnered with Tom, a new member of the marketing team she hadn't interacted with much. Tom gave her a friendly smile. "Ready to give this a shot?" he asked. Sarah took a deep breath. This was a moment of choice. She could let her anxiety take over, could retreat into her shell and go through the motions. Or she could embrace this opportunity, could choose to fully engage despite her fear. "Ready as I'll ever be," she replied, returning Tom's smile. As they began the exercise, Sarah found herself struggling at first. Her mind raced, trying to anticipate what Tom might say, trying to plan her responses. But as the exercise continued, something began to shift. She found herself listening more intently to Tom, focusing on the present moment rather than worrying about what came next. And then, almost without realizing it, Sarah found herself having fun. She and Tom created an increasingly absurd scenario involving a talking giraffe and a secret underground city. Sarah heard herself saying things she never would have planned, saw herself gesturing dramatically in ways she normally would have been too self-conscious to attempt. When Jamie called time on the exercise, Sarah was surprised to find herself slightly disappointed that it was over. As she and Tom rejoined the larger group, she caught sight of Mark. Her boss gave her an approving nod, and Sarah felt a warm glow of pride. This initial success gave Sarah a boost of confidence as they moved into the next activities. Throughout the day, she found herself volunteering for things she normally would have avoided, speaking up in group discussions, and even leading a small team in a problem-solving challenge. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when Sarah felt her old anxieties creeping in, when she had to consciously remind herself to stay present and not get lost in overthinking. But each time she pushed through these moments, she felt a little stronger, a little more confident. The real test came on the second day of the retreat. Jamie announced that the afternoon would be devoted to a series of trust-building exercises, culminating in a high ropes course. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Heights had always been a particular fear of hers, and the thought of navigating obstacles suspended in the air sent a jolt of panic through her. Her first instinct was to find a way to opt out, to come up with some excuse why she couldn't participate. But as she stood there, heart racing, Sarah thought about how far she had come. She thought about all the work she had done in therapy, all the small victories she had achieved over the past months. Was she really going to let fear hold her back now? Taking a deep breath, Sarah made a decision. She would do the ropes course, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she was choosing to face that fear head-on. As she put on the safety harness and listened to the instructor's guidelines, Sarah focused on her breathing. She reminded herself that she was safe, that the harness would catch her if she fell. When it was her turn to climb the ladder to the first platform, her hands were shaking, but she forced herself to keep moving. The first few obstacles were challenging but manageable. Sarah found that if she focused on each step, each movement, rather than looking down or thinking too far ahead, she could keep her fear at bay. She was so concentrated on the task at hand that she almost didn't notice how high she had climbed. Then came the most daunting obstacle, a long zip line stretching between two platforms. Sarah froze. The distance seemed impossible, the drop below her terrifying. For a moment, she was sure she couldn't do it. But then she heard a voice from below. "You've got this, Sarah." It was Tom, cheering her on. And suddenly, Sarah realized she wasn't alone in this. Her colleagues were below her, supporting her. Dr. Chen's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her of how far she had come. Sarah took a deep breath. She thought of all the times her overthinking had held her back, all the opportunities she had missed because of fear. Not this time, she decided. With her heart pounding, Sarah stepped off the platform. For a breathless moment, she felt like she was falling. Then the line caught, and she was soaring through the air. The wind rushed past her face, and suddenly, improbably, Sarah found herself laughing out loud. As she landed on the other platform, legs shaking but grinning from ear to ear, Sarah felt something shift inside her. She had done it. She had faced her fear, had pushed through the overthinking and anxiety, and had come out the other side. The rest of the course seemed almost easy in comparison. When Sarah's feet finally touched the ground again, she was met with cheers and high fives from her colleagues. But more important than their approval was the feeling of triumph welling up inside her. That evening, as the team gathered around a bonfire for their final activity, Sarah found herself volunteering to speak. In the flickering firelight, she told her colleagues about her struggles with anxiety and overthinking. She shared how this retreat had challenged her, how facing her fears on the ropes course had been a turning point for her. "I've realized," she said, her voice strong and clear, "that I'm capable of so much more than my fears would have me believe. That when I stop overthinking and start living, amazing things can happen." The supportive responses from her colleagues were overwhelming. Many of them opened up about their own struggles and insecurities. Mark, her boss, pulled her aside afterwards to express how proud he was of her growth. As Sarah lay in her bunk that night, unable to sleep from the adrenaline and emotion of the day, she reflected on how far she had come. The Sarah of a few months ago would never have believed she was capable of what she had accomplished today. She reached for her journal one last time and wrote, "Today was a turning point. I faced my fears, I pushed past my overthinking, and I discovered a strength in myself I never knew existed. This doesn't mean my anxiety is gone forever, or that I'll never overthink again. But now I know that I have the power to choose how I respond to those thoughts and feelings. I'm not controlled by them anymore. This is just the beginning. I'm excited to see what else I'm capable of, what other limits I can push past. For the first time in a long time, I'm looking forward to the future instead of fearing it. As Sarah closed her journal and settled back into her bunk, she felt a profound sense of peace. The path ahead wouldn't always be easy, she knew. There would still be challenges to face, moments of doubt to overcome. But she had found a new strength within herself, a resilience she never knew she possessed. This weekend had been more than just a company retreat. It had been a turning point, a moment of transformation. Sarah had taken a leap, literally and figuratively, and had discovered that she could fly. As she drifted off to sleep, Sarah felt a sense of excitement for what the future held. She was ready to embrace life with open arms, to live fully and authentically, without letting overthinking hold her back. This was just the beginning of a new chapter in her life, and she couldn't wait to see where it would lead. Chapter 7. Embracing Imperfection. The weeks following the company retreat were transformative for Sarah. The experience had ignited a spark within her, a newfound courage to face her fears and challenge her long-held beliefs about perfection and control. As she returned to her daily routine, Sarah found herself approaching life with a fresh perspective, one that embraced the unpredictable and imperfect nature of existence. One Monday morning, as Sarah settled into her desk at work, she noticed a small potted plant sitting next to her computer. A note attached read, "To Sarah, a reminder of your growth. Keep reaching for the sun. Mark." The gesture touched her deeply, serving as a tangible reminder of how far she had come and the support she had from those around her. As she looked at the plant, with its slightly asymmetrical leaves and a stem that leaned just a bit to the left, Sarah smiled. In the past, she might have been bothered by its imperfections, might have spent time trying to shape it into a more perfect form. Now, she saw beauty in its uniqueness. This shift in perspective began to manifest in various aspects of Sarah's life. In team meetings, she found herself more willing to share ideas that weren't fully formed, to contribute to brainstorming sessions without fear of saying something stupid. She noticed that her colleagues seemed to appreciate her input more, often building on her suggestions in ways she hadn't anticipated. One particularly memorable instance occurred during a crucial project meeting. As the team discussed strategies for an upcoming marketing campaign, Sarah felt an idea forming. In the past, she would have kept quiet, worried that her concept wasn't fully developed or might be rejected. But this time, she took a deep breath and spoke up. "What if we approach this from a different angle?" she suggested, her voice slightly shaky but growing stronger as she continued. "Instead of focusing on the product's features, what if we highlighted the imperfect, real-life moments where it makes a difference?" The room fell silent for a moment, and Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in her stomach. But then, to her surprise, her colleagues began to nod enthusiastically. "That's brilliant, Sarah," exclaimed her colleague, Tom. "We could show the product in action during those messy, unpredictable moments of life. It's relatable and authentic." As the team built upon her idea, crafting a campaign concept that celebrated the beauty of imperfection, Sarah felt a warm glow of pride. She had taken a risk, had shared an imperfect idea, and it had led to something exciting and innovative. This experience at work bolstered Sarah's confidence and encouraged her to embrace imperfection in other areas of her life. She decided to revisit her long-abandoned hobby of painting, something she had given up years ago because she felt her work wasn't good enough. Sarah set up a small easel in the corner of her living room and began to paint in the evenings after work. Her first attempts were clumsy and far from the vision she had in her mind. In the past, this would have frustrated her to the point of giving up. But now, Sarah found herself enjoying the process, appreciating the learning curve and the unexpected results that came from her experiments with color and form. One Saturday afternoon, as Sarah was working on a particularly challenging landscape painting, her sister Emily dropped by unexpectedly. In the past, Sarah would have quickly hidden her work, embarrassed to show something unfinished and imperfect. But this time, she invited Emily in to see what she was working on. "Wow, Sarah, this is beautiful," Emily exclaimed, studying the canvas with genuine interest. Sarah laughed. "It's far from perfect. I'm still struggling with getting the perspective right, and I'm not sure about the colors." Emily turned to her sister with a smile. "But that's what makes it interesting. It's uniquely yours. I can see your personality in every brushstroke." This comment struck Sarah deeply. She realized that by embracing imperfection in her art, she was allowing her true self to shine through. The flaws and quirks in her painting weren't mistakes to be corrected, but expressions of her individuality. Encouraged by this realization, Sarah decided to take another step outside her comfort zone. She signed up for a local art class, where she would have to share her work with others and receive critiques. The night before her first class, she felt the familiar tendrils of anxiety creeping in. What if everyone else was better than her? What if the instructor thought her work was terrible? Sarah took a deep breath and reached for her journal. She wrote, "I'm feeling nervous about the art class tomorrow, but I'm reminding myself that perfection isn't the goal. The goal is to learn, to grow, to express myself. My work doesn't have to be flawless to be valuable. I'm choosing to embrace the imperfect process of learning and creating." The art class turned out to be a transformative experience for Sarah. She found herself surrounded by people of all skill levels, each bringing their unique perspective and style to their work. The instructor, a kind-faced woman named Claire, emphasized the importance of experimentation and self-expression over technical perfection. During one class, as Sarah struggled with a particularly challenging still life, Claire came to observe her work. Sarah braced herself for criticism, but Claire simply smiled and said, "I love how you're not afraid to use bold colors. Your style is really starting to emerge." This comment made Sarah pause. She had a style? She had been so focused on trying to make her painting look right that she hadn't even noticed the unique elements she was bringing to her work. As the weeks went by, Sarah found herself looking forward to her art classes more and more. She began to see her imperfections not as flaws to be hidden, but as the very things that made her work interesting and unique. This mindset started to spill over into other areas of her life as well. At work, Sarah began to approach problems with more creativity and less fear of failure. She volunteered for projects that pushed her out of her comfort zone, knowing that even if she didn't perform perfectly, she would learn and grow from the experience. In her personal life, Sarah found herself being more open and vulnerable with friends and family. She shared her struggles and insecurities, no longer feeling the need to present a perfect facade. To her surprise, these honest conversations led to deeper, more meaningful relationships. One evening, as Sarah was having dinner with a group of friends, the conversation turned to insecurities and self-doubt. In the past, Sarah would have remained quiet, afraid to expose her own vulnerabilities. But this time, she took a deep breath and shared her journey with overthinking and anxiety. "I always felt like I had to be perfect," she explained. "Like any mistake or flaw would prove that I wasn't good enough. But I'm learning that it's our imperfections that make us human, that allow us to connect with others." Her friends listened attentively, and when Sarah finished speaking, something remarkable happened. One by one, they began to open up about their own struggles and insecurities. The evening turned into a powerful moment of connection and mutual support, all because Sarah had been willing to embrace and share her imperfections. As Sarah continued to work with Dr. Chun, they explored this new theme of embracing imperfection. Dr. Chun introduced Sarah to the concept of wabi-sabi, a Japanese philosophy that finds beauty in imperfection and impermanence. In Japanese ceramics, Dr. Chun explained, there's a practice called kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold. The idea is that the cracks and repairs become part of the object's history, making it more beautiful and valuable. Can you see how this might apply to your own life, Sarah? Sarah thought about this deeply. She realized that her struggles with anxiety and overthinking, while challenging, had also led her to this moment of growth and self-discovery. The cracks in her life had created space for new understanding and strength to emerge. With this new perspective, Sarah began to see her past struggles not as failures or flaws, but as important parts of her journey. She started to appreciate the resilience she had developed, the empathy she had gained for others who were struggling, and the deeper understanding she now had of herself. One day, as Sarah was leaving her therapy session, Dr. Chen said something that resonated deeply. "Remember, Sarah, the goal isn't to be perfect. The goal is to be whole, and that includes embracing all parts of yourself, even the parts you once saw as flaws." These words stayed with Sarah, becoming a mantra of sorts as she continued to navigate her new approach to life. She found herself repeating them in moments of self-doubt or when she felt the old perfectionist tendencies creeping back in. As Sarah embraced imperfection in various aspects of her life, she noticed a profound change in how she felt day to day. The constant pressure to be perfect, to control every outcome, had lifted. In its place was a sense of freedom and joy that she hadn't experienced since childhood. She found herself laughing more easily, taking pleasure in small moments that she would have overlooked before. A slightly burnt piece of toast became an opportunity to appreciate the taste of the jam. A rainy day that ruined her plans became a chance to enjoy a cozy afternoon at home with a good book. Even in her relationships, Sarah noticed a shift. By allowing herself to be imperfect, to be vulnerable, she created space for deeper connections. She was no longer constantly on guard, trying to present a flawless image. Instead, she was authentic, real, and much more relaxed. One weekend, Sarah decided to host a dinner party for her friends, something she would have found incredibly stressful in the past. As she prepared the meal, she found herself enjoying the process rather than obsessing over every detail. When she accidentally overcooked the vegetables, instead of panicking, she simply laughed and turned it into a joke with her guests. The evening was filled with laughter, good conversation, and a warmth that came from genuine connection. As her friends were leaving, one of them hugged Sarah tightly and said, "This was wonderful. You seem so happy and relaxed these days." Sarah smiled, realizing that it was true. By embracing imperfection, she had opened herself up to a fuller, richer experience of life. She was no longer watching from the sidelines, held back by fear of making mistakes. She was fully participating, embracing both the highs and lows, the successes and the failures. That night, as Sarah got ready for bed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. The face looking back at her was the same one she had always known, with its familiar features and imperfections. But now, she saw it differently. She saw strength in the lines around her eyes, character in the slight asymmetry of her smile, beauty in the uniqueness of her features. Sarah reached for her journal and wrote, "Today, I am grateful for my imperfections. They are not flaws to be fixed, but parts of what make me uniquely me. I'm learning that true growth doesn't come from trying to be perfect, but from embracing who I am, flaws and all. Life isn't about achieving perfection. It's about experiencing fully, learning constantly, and loving myself through it all. I am imperfect, and that's more than okay. It's beautiful." As Sarah closed her journal and turned off the light, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The journey of embracing imperfection wasn't over. She knew there would still be moments of self-doubt, times when the old perfectionist tendencies would try to reassert themselves. But now she had the tools, the understanding, and the self-compassion to meet those moments with grace and kindness. Sarah drifted off to sleep, looking forward to another day of living fully and authentically, imperfections and all. She was no longer striving for an impossible ideal of perfection. Instead, she was embracing the beautiful, messy, imperfect reality of being human. And in that embrace, she had found a joy and freedom she had never known before. Chapter 8. The New Sarah. As the seasons changed and autumn gave way to winter, Sarah found herself reflecting on the profound transformation she had undergone. The woman who had once been paralyzed by overthinking and the pursuit of perfection was slowly, but surely giving way to a new Sarah, one who embraced life's uncertainties and found beauty in imperfection. One crisp December morning, as Sarah walked to work, she caught her reflection in a shop window. She paused, struck by what she saw. The face looking back at her was familiar, yet somehow different. There was a lightness in her eyes, a relaxed set to her shoulders that hadn't been there before. She smiled at her reflection, recognizing this as a physical manifestation of her inner change. At the office, Sarah's new approach to life was having a noticeable impact on her work. Her willingness to take risks and share ideas without overthinking had led to her taking on more responsibility. Today, she was preparing to lead a major presentation to a potential client, something that would have terrified her just a few months ago. As she set up the conference room, Sarah felt the familiar flutter of nerves in her stomach. But instead of letting it overwhelm her, she took a deep breath and reminded herself of how far she'd come. "You've got this," she whispered to herself, a small ritual of self-encouragement she had developed. The presentation went better than Sarah could have imagined. She spoke with confidence, easily fielding questions and adapting when the client threw a few curveballs. When an unexpected technical glitch occurred, instead of panicking, Sarah handled it with humor and grace, turning what could have been a disaster into a moment that actually endeared her to the client. After the meeting, Mark pulled Sarah aside. "That was impressive, Sarah," he said, his eyes twinkling with pride. "You've really come into your own these past few months. I think it's time we discussed your future here." Sarah felt a surge of excitement mixed with a tinge of her old anxiety. But she took a deep breath and reminded herself that whatever came next, she could handle it. "I'm ready for that conversation," she replied, her voice steady and confident. Later that week, Sarah met with Mark and the head of their department. To her surprise and delight, they offered her a promotion to team leader. It was a role that would challenge her, pushing her to grow even further out of her comfort zone. In the past, Sarah might have hesitated, overthinking every possible scenario and talking herself out of the opportunity. But the new Sarah saw this for what it was, a chance to continue her growth and make a real impact. With a smile, she accepted the offer. As she settled into her new role, Sarah found that her journey of self-discovery and growth had equipped her with valuable skills for leadership. Her empathy, born from her own struggles, allowed her to connect with her team members on a deeper level. Her newfound ability to embrace imperfection meant she could create an environment where creativity and innovation flourished. One day, as Sarah was mentoring a younger team member who was struggling with self-doubt, she found herself sharing her own story. "I used to be trapped by my own thoughts," she explained. "I was so afraid of making mistakes that I nearly missed out on living." The young woman looked at Sarah with a mix of surprise and relief. "But you always seem so confident," she said. "I never would have guessed you struggled with that." Sarah smiled. "Confidence isn't about never feeling fear or doubt," she said. "It's about learning to move forward despite those feelings. It's about embracing the journey, imperfections and all." As she spoke, Sarah realized how far she had come. She was now able to use her experiences to help others, to be a source of strength and inspiration. It was a role she never would have imagined for herself in the past, but one that now felt natural and deeply fulfilling. Outside of work, Sarah's personal life was blossoming as well. Her newfound openness and authenticity had deepened her existing relationships and allowed her to form new ones. She had started volunteering at a local community center, teaching art classes to children. The joy she found in encouraging their creativity and helping them embrace their unique styles was immeasurable. Sarah's relationship with her family had also undergone a transformation. One Sunday afternoon, as she sat in her parents' living room, sharing stories and laughter with her sister and parents, she was struck by how different things felt. There was an ease, a closeness that hadn't been there before. "You seem so happy these days, sweetheart," her mother said, reaching out to squeeze Sarah's hand. "It's wonderful to see." Sarah smiled, feeling a wave of emotion wash over her. "I am happy," she replied. "I'm learning to embrace life fully, to accept myself as I am. It's not always easy, but it's so worth it." Her father, usually a man of few words, cleared his throat. "We're proud of you, Sarah," he said softly. "Not because of your job or your achievements, but because of the person you've become. Your strength, your kindness. That's what matters." Tears pricked Sarah's eyes as she absorbed her father's words. She realized that this This connection, this love, was what she had been searching for all along. Not perfection, not flawless achievement, but genuine, imperfect, beautiful human connection. As winter turned to spring, Sarah found herself embarking on a new adventure. Inspired by her journey and encouraged by Dr. Chen, she had started writing a blog about her experiences with overthinking and her path to embracing imperfection. To her surprise and delight, her words resonated with many people. Comments poured in from readers who saw themselves in Sarah's story, who found hope and inspiration in her journey. Sarah was deeply moved by the connections she was forming through her writing. She began to see that by sharing her story, by being vulnerable and authentic, she was helping others feel less alone in their struggles. One evening, as Sarah was responding to comments on her latest blog post, she received an email that made her heart skip a beat. It was from a publishing house, expressing interest in turning her blog into a book. For a moment, Sarah felt the old familiar panic rising. Write a book? Her? But then she took a deep breath and smiled. This was an opportunity to share her message with even more people, to potentially help others who were struggling as she had. Yes, it would be challenging. Yes, there would be moments of self-doubt. But she was ready for it. As Sarah began the process of turning her blog into a book, she found that the lessons she had learned about embracing imperfection were more valuable than ever. Writing wasn't always easy. There were days when the words wouldn't come, when she questioned every sentence. But instead of letting these challenges derail her, she accepted them as part of the process. She set up a small writing nook in her apartment, complete with her easel in the corner. On days when the writing felt difficult, she would take a break to paint, allowing her creativity to flow in a different way. She found that this balance helped her stay centered and focused, preventing her from falling back into patterns of overthinking and perfectionism. As her book began to take shape, Sarah realized that she was not just recounting her past experiences, but continuing to grow and evolve through the writing process itself. Each chapter felt like a conversation with her readers, an opportunity to connect and share insights. One day, as Sarah was deep in the writing process, she received a call from Emily. Her sister was excited, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Sarah, I've been offered a job in New York. It's an amazing opportunity, but I'm scared. What if I'm not good enough? What if I'm making a mistake?" Sarah felt a surge of empathy, remembering all too well how paralyzing those fears could be. But she also felt a deep sense of gratitude that she was now in a position to help her sister navigate these feelings. "Emily," she said gently, "those fears are normal. But don't let them hold you back. You are more than capable. And even if things don't go perfectly, which they won't, because nothing ever does, you'll learn and grow from the experience." As she spoke, Sarah realized she was not just reassuring her sister, but articulating the philosophy that now guided her own life. Embracing imperfection, taking risks, valuing growth over perfection, these were the principles of the new Sarah. Emily was quiet for a moment, then said, "When did you get so wise? Big sisters?" Sarah laughed. "I'm not wise," she replied. "I'm just learning, every day, to embrace life in all its messy, imperfect glory. And you can too." After the call, Sarah returned to her writing with renewed energy. Her conversation with Emily had reminded her of why this book was so important. It wasn't just her story, it was a message of hope and empowerment for anyone who had ever felt trapped by their own thoughts. As spring turned to summer, Sarah's book neared completion. The process had been challenging, exhilarating, and profoundly rewarding. As she wrote the final chapter, she felt a sense of completion, not just of the book, but of a phase in her life. The new Sarah was not a final, perfected version of herself. She was instead a work in progress, constantly growing, learning, and evolving. She had learned to embrace the journey, to find joy in the process rather than fixating on some imagined perfect endpoint. On a warm summer evening, Sarah sat on her balcony, looking out over the city as the sun set. She held in her hands the first printed copy of her book. Running her fingers over the cover, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment and gratitude. Opening the book to the dedication page, she read the words she had written. To everyone who has ever felt trapped by their own thoughts, remember, you are not your fears. You are not your anxieties. You are a beautiful, imperfect, ever-evolving human being. Embrace your journey. As she closed the book, Sarah smiled to herself. The journey that had begun in anxiety and self-doubt had led her here, to a place of self-acceptance, courage, and joy. She was not perfect, and her life was not without challenges. But she was living fully, authentically, embracing each day with open arms. The new Sarah was not defined by her ability to control every outcome or to achieve some impossible standard of perfection. Instead, she was defined by her resilience, her empathy, her willingness to embrace life in all its messy, beautiful complexity. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She was exactly where she needed to be, exactly who she needed to be. And whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, she was ready to face them, not with fear, but with courage, compassion, and an open heart. The new Sarah was not an end point, but a continuing journey. And it was a journey she was profoundly grateful to be on. Epilogue. A letter to the reader. Dear reader, if you've made it this far, I want to thank you. Thank you for joining me on this journey, for walking alongside Sarah as she navigated the tumultuous waters of overthinking and emerged stronger, more resilient, and more authentically herself. As I sit here, penning this letter to you, I'm filled with a profound sense of gratitude and hope. You see, Sarah's story is not just a work of fiction. It's a reflection of a journey that so many of us embark upon, a journey of self-discovery, of battling our inner demons, and of learning to embrace the beautiful imperfections that make us uniquely human. Perhaps you saw yourself in Sarah's struggles. Maybe you recognize the paralyzing grip of overthinking, the exhausting pursuit of perfection, or the fear of making mistakes that keeps you from fully living. If so, I want you to know that you're not alone. Far from it. As I wrote Sarah's story, I drew from my own experiences, from the stories shared by friends, family, and clients, and from the universal human experience of grappling with our own minds. The truth is, we all have a little bit of Sarah in us. We all have moments where our thoughts threaten to overwhelm us, where we doubt ourselves, where we're afraid to take risks or show our true selves to the world. But here's the beautiful thing. We also all have the capacity for growth, for change, for embracing life in all its messy glory. Just as Sarah learned to quiet the storm of overthinking in her mind, so too can we learn to navigate our own thought patterns with more grace and self-compassion. Throughout this book, we've explored several key themes that I believe are crucial for anyone looking to break free from the cycle of overthinking and embrace a more authentic, fulfilling life. Let's revisit them briefly. 1. The power of awareness. Sarah's journey began when she became aware of her overthinking patterns. This awareness is the first step towards change. I encourage you to cultivate mindfulness in your own life. Pay attention to your thoughts without judgment. Notice when you're spiraling into overthinking. This awareness alone can be transformative. 2. Embracing imperfection. One of the most powerful lessons Sarah learned was the beauty of imperfection. In a world that often seems to demand perfection, it's revolutionary to embrace our flaws, our mistakes, our humanity. Remember, it's our imperfections that make us unique, that allow us to connect with others, that make us real. 3. The courage to be vulnerable. Sarah's life began to change when she had the courage to be vulnerable. With her boss, with her therapist, with her friends and family. Vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the ultimate act of bravery. It's saying, this is me, imperfections and all. I encourage you to practice vulnerability in your own life. You might be surprised by the connections and opportunities it creates. 4. The importance of self-compassion. Throughout her journey, Sarah learned to be kinder to herself, to treat herself with the same compassion she would offer a friend. This self-compassion was crucial in helping her overcome her tendency to overthink. Remember to be gentle with yourself. You're doing the best you can with the tools you have. 5. The value of professional help. Sarah's sessions with Dr. Chin played a crucial role in her growth. If you're struggling with overthinking or anxiety, don't hesitate to seek professional help. A trained therapist can provide valuable tools and insights to support your journey. 6. The power of small steps. Sarah's transformation didn't happen overnight. It was the result of many small steps, small victories, small moments of choosing differently. Don't underestimate the power of small changes in your own life. Every time you choose self-compassion over self-criticism, every time you take a risk despite your fear, you're growing. 7. The beauty of authenticity. As Sarah learned to embrace her true self, imperfections and all, her life became richer and more fulfilling. There's incredible power in authenticity. When we drop the mask of perfection and show up as our real selves, we open the door to genuine connection and joy. Now, I want to address something important. You might be thinking, this all sounds great, but my overthinking is different. My anxiety is too severe. I can't change. I want you to know that I hear you. I understand that fear, but I also want to challenge it. You see, the brain is incredibly plastic. It has the ability to form new neural pathways throughout our lives. What this means is that no matter how long you've been struggling with overthinking, no matter how ingrained these patterns might feel, change is possible. It might not be easy, and it certainly won't happen overnight, but with patience, persistence, and the right support, you can learn to relate to your thoughts in a new way. Remember how Sarah felt at the beginning of her journey? Overwhelmed, stuck, certain that she was somehow fundamentally flawed? And remember how she felt by the end? Confident, resilient, embracing life with open arms? That transformation is possible for you too. But, and this is important, the goal isn't to become a different person. It's not about eradicating all anxiety or never having a negative thought again. That's not realistic, and it's not even desirable. Our challenges, our struggles, our anxieties, they're part of what makes us human. The goal is to learn to coexist with these experiences without letting them control us. It's about expanding our capacity to hold difficult emotions, to sit with uncertainty, to embrace the fullness of the human experience. As you move forward from this book, I encourage you to be patient and kind with yourself. Change is a process, not an event. There will be setbacks. There will be days when overthinking gets the better of you. That's okay. It doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're human. On those difficult days, I hope you'll remember Sarah. Remember how she learned to observe her thoughts without getting caught up in them. Remember how she gradually built her resilience, one small step at a time. Remember how she learned to embrace her imperfections and live more authentically. And remember this, you are not your thoughts. You are the awareness behind your thoughts. You are the one who can observe your mind's chatter and choose how to respond. This awareness is your superpower. It's the key to freedom from the tyranny of overthinking. I also want to encourage you to seek support on your journey. This might mean talking to a therapist, joining a support group, or simply opening up to trusted friends or family members. There's incredible power in sharing our struggles and realizing we're not alone. Connection and community can be powerful antidotes to the isolation that often comes with overthinking. As we come to the end of this letter, I want to share a practice that has been incredibly helpful in my own life and in the lives of many others I've worked with. It's a simple gratitude practice, but with a twist. Each day, try to find something to be grateful for in a moment of imperfection. Maybe you're grateful for the laughter that erupted when you mispronounced a word in a meeting. Maybe you're grateful for the way your partner lovingly teased you about your messy hair. Maybe you're grateful for the unexpected creative solution that arose from a mistake. By actively looking for gratitude in imperfection, we train our brains to see the beauty in the mess of everyday life. We learn to embrace the full spectrum of human experience rather than constantly striving for an impossible ideal of perfection. Lastly, I want you to know that your story matters. Your struggles, your victories, your unique journey, they're all important. By working on ourselves, by learning to quiet the storm of overthinking in our own minds, we don't just improve our own lives. We become beacons of hope for others. We create ripples of change that extend far beyond ourselves. Just as Sarah's growth positively impacted her relationships, her work, and even inspired her to write a book, your journey has the potential to inspire and uplift others. Every time you choose self-compassion over self-criticism, every time you embrace your authentic self, every time you take a step forward despite your fears, you're not just changing your own life. You're contributing to a world where it's a little bit easier for all of us to be human. So, dear reader, as you close this book and continue on your own journey, I hope you'll carry with you the lessons of Sarah's story. I hope you'll remember that you are not alone, that change is possible, and that there is immense beauty and strength in embracing your imperfect, authentic self. Remember, you are not your thoughts. You are not your fears. You are a beautiful, complex, ever-evolving human being. You are worthy of love, joy, and fulfillment, not in spite of your imperfections, but because of them. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your journey. I believe in you, and I'm rooting for you every step of the way. With warmth, hope, and gratitude, Malin. P.S. If Sarah's story has resonated with you, if you found hope or inspiration in these pages, I'd love to hear from you. Your experiences, your insights, your own journey, they all matter. They're all part of the beautiful tapestry of human experience. So if you feel moved to do so, please reach out. Share your story. Because in sharing our stories, we not only heal ourselves, but we create the possibility of healing for others. And remember, your journey doesn't end with the closing of this book. It continues with every breath, every moment, every choice. Embrace it. Live it fully. And always be kind to yourself along the way. Wishing you peace, courage, and joy on your path. Malin.